And so she taught my client to do the same thing. Fast forward 20 years, my client is a comedy writer. What does that tell you?
I think this is another blog post of yours, but I wanted to expand on it.
Sure.
So writers are great at explaining in someone else's story, but what about their own? Especially when it comes to presenting themselves to the world, to the studio system. What is that refining of their own story? What is too much? How truthful do they be?
You want a writer to be truthful when they talk about themselves, but you have to also remember that a writer's first story is their own. So if they don't know how to tell their story, it's going to be tough to trust them with other stories. So you really have to figure out where is the juice in your story. It's never in chronology, or very rarely in chronology. If you travel to space, sure, chronology is just fine. But it is about finding a way to connect your human experience, for lack of better words, to the person who's sitting across from you, to become interesting, to become unique, to tell them a story they haven't heard that is truthful in yours, and it can be completely anecdotal. I've certainly talked to people who start out saying, I've never done anything interesting in my life. Well, then what's your point of view on the things that you've done? What have you made of your experiences? To find those stories that really speak to who you are as a person and a writer. To tell something interesting and unique so that a month later, a month after a general with an executive, be it in a production company or a studio, that executive looks at a piece of work and says, hey, what happened to the writer who? The writer who had that experience that I can bring into this one. So it is about sharing those experiences, those points of view, and finding a way to tell that personal story that is meaningful and that is connective and that isn't tied up in a bow. It doesn't have to be pretty. It has to be memorable and eloquent. You have to be comfortable talking about it. So it can't turn into a therapy session. But it has to be that story that nobody else has to tell. So, for a while, everybody was talking about writers who would go into networks and talk about how television was their only friend. We've heard a lot of those stories, so those stories are no longer unique. Every writer, every person has an experience, has a point of view that is uniquely theirs. You don't have to take half an hour to tell it. In fact, we want it told in 2 minutes, in 3 minutes, the most. But relate to us something that we can remember that speaks to who you are, because that's who we want to work with. I have a writer who is super talented, lovely, lovely woman, very, very shy, who came to me and said, I don't know what my personal story is and I can't really talk about it. And so I had her bring in a lot of anecdotes. And there were a lot of different stories and they all came out kind of sad. And the problem was that she's a comedy writer. Till one day she brought me a story about her mother. She's Korean, she grew up naturally with a Korean mother who was obsessed with not wrinkling her face. So she taught herself how to laugh without moving any of the muscles on her face so that she would never age. And so she taught my client to do the same thing. Fast forward 20 years, my client is a comedy writer. What does that tell you? Of course, she told it with a little bit more flair and detail, but those are the kind of stories that stick, that are unique, that are memorable, that nobody else has. Those are the stories that you want to share with the industry because they'll remember you that way.
Okay, so if someone's envisioning their story and how they may explain it, first off, how will they, or in what arena will they be telling this story? Like, when would it ever come up to say, hey, you know what, Lee, tell me about yourself. I've seen what you've written, but I want to know your deal.
In every general meeting, an executive will sit you down and literally say, so, tell me about yourself. Just like that. We talked earlier, I was doing a lot of interviews for this book that I just written, and in that environment, I'd gone in to meet with agents, managers, executives I've never met with before. I can't tell you how many times folks that I was interviewing would sit down with me and say, so, Lee, tell me about yourself. Those are the moments that it's asked, and it's in every general. It's in every opportunity. Who are you? Is there anything for us to connect on? Is it the story that you tell? Is it the way that you tell that story? Is it the sensibility with which you see the world? So it's in every general meeting, every last general meeting. Tell me about yourself. Other than what else do you have? It's perhaps the most popular question in this industry.
Lee, where would someone actually be telling their story, and how deep do they go? How light do they keep it? Can I envision the scenario as to how someone's going to be asking about me?
Sure. Oftentimes it's going to happen in a general meeting. Niceties, bottle of water, tell me about yourself. Can I get you something to drink? Tell me about yourself. It's very blunt and upfront, and do your show. I have writers who have different versions of their stories. So I have one writer who suffered a traumatic event in her childhood, and if she is meeting with somebody that she feels an instant bond and trust with, then she will go deeper, she will go darker. With others, she will leave the nitty-gritty out. So you tailor your story a little bit to see how dark you want to go where, but the rule is never make it a therapy session, never bring in a story that you're not ready to talk about openly without breaking down, without having a moment of tears. All of that is unnecessary, because specifically in TV really looks at what do you bring into the room, right? It's not just what your writing is, but what personal experience, what themes speak to you, what do you bring with you into the writer's room? So they want to know that you're capable of talking about whatever it is you're bringing comfortably, that it's not going to be a therapy session, that there's not going to be suddenly an elephant in the room that makes everybody uncomfortable. So you want to have those layers to the story. Comedy writers tend to really look for the lighter, fluffier, happier stuff, or the really dark stuff told in a very funny way. Tragedy via comedy. But drama writers tend to have those more layered stories that they choose how deeply to go into. So if it's being abandoned by your father, is it, the life of petty crime you're forced into at 12 and how cute you were getting away with it? Or was it the nights that you spent alone and when you didn't have money to pay for electricity, and what that felt like, and what it felt like when social services showed up and tried to uproot you from your home? Those are different ways to tell the same story. So writers really do pick and choose, and it's important that you assess your environment to really determine which version of which story you're telling. Ultimately, it's always going to be the same story because you're going to get known for that story, and then there'll be other anecdotes that will come along with it. But it really is about finding that core story and taking it out there and getting the industry to know you through it.
Okay, so different versions.
Yeah.
Maybe have an A, B, and C version.
Yeah, you have the kind of deep version where you really kind of drill into the story, and then you have your more, for lack of better words, shallow version of it that is less confrontational, less demanding of the listener, less uncomfortable potentially. It really is how you look at it. Some writers prefer to not expose any sort of wound when they talk about a personal story. They're perfectly happy to stay surfacey and just allude to a wound, but it really is about planning it and rehearsing it and exploring it so that when you go into a room, that's not when you're excavating your own story and figuring out what works.